Okay. I'd like to welcome all of you to what is effectively our first in-person lecture event since March 2020. So on behalf of the Center for South Asian and Indian Ocean Studies, I hope that this is just the first of many more in-person events. I'd like to welcome all of you to this event, which I think is going on here. And I want to begin by thanking, as always, our graduate assistant, without whom, Professor Shehzad, without none of this would be possible, and also our co-sponsors, the History Department, for their logistical support. Our guest speaker today is Saroop Ijaz, a lawyer and human rights activist based in Lahore. He's one of the few voices of reason still holding their own in what has become an increasingly restrictive and polarized space for civil discourse and exchange in Pakistan. He is a senior consultant for Asia Human Rights Watch. He's a member of the Human Rights Commission of Pakistan. He's also a visiting faculty at the Lahore University of Management Sciences, LUMS. Through his presence on these various forums, Saroop has fearlessly defended the fundamental rights of religious minorities, not to say citizens of Pakistan, spearheaded the call for urgent police reforms and public accountability. The condition of Afghan refugees languishing in camps in Pakistan has also attracted his attention. And he's been at the forefront on a wide range of public interest issues. He served as amicus curiae for a number of constitutional cases in Pakistan and been a consultant as well as advisor to the European Union, International Commission of Jurists, British Council, and various such organizations. He also writes regularly as a voice to be reckoned with in the Pakistani press, but also international publications like the LA Times, The Guardian, Open Democracy, The Jurist, amongst others. When I asked him to speak at Tufts, he very graciously agreed to include in the conversation India and Bangladesh, and I don't know whether Sri Lanka figures, but certainly in the discussion as the theme of his talk today, shrinking space for civil society and free expression is hardly a matter specific to Pakistan. And with the Taliban triumphant in Afghanistan, it is compelling to ask how much more shrinking of space is likely in the months ahead, and what, if any, countervailing factors are in play to prevent South Asia becoming an arena where fair rather than free expression is the prevalent trend. Please join me in warmly welcoming Saroop from Tufts.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. I'm very glad to be at Tufts, and I'm very grateful for the very generous introduction by Professor Ayesha Jalal. And just to have the privilege, an honor to not only engage with you, but with her as an icon, as a leading public intellectual of South Asia. And I think the canvas for our conversation, the shrinking space for civil society in South Asia, and as Professor Jalal said, that it's not restricted to one country, but what we're seeing are the trends which we now see, which are common. There's a common theme amongst these countries, and I mean, which is every country's journey perhaps been different, or perhaps slightly different. But now what we see in terms of civil society space is, and firstly, I think, an erosion of media freedoms. That's a primary casualty of this round of assault on civil liberties, on free expression, this round of democratic backsliding. And that, I think, is a common theme now across South Asia. It has, to varying degrees, it is true at the different kinds of almost all South Asian countries. Pakistan has had great challenges with free expression. But I mean, hopefully I'll get to that. But what that led to, historically, was also a very robust resistance amongst the media. So there was an assault on free expression during, let's say, military dictatorships, and that was met with very robust resistance to it. Similarly, in India, for example, even while the democratic experience was by no means perfect. What India did have a vibrant civil society and a free media. And now increasingly, if we take these two countries as examples, that's under challenge in both in ways which are new and to extents which might be unprecedented. And hopefully we'll get to talk about that. The second, I think, would be from a human rights perspective, is freedom of religion. That's again a challenge which is much to be said on Pakistan, and hopefully during the course of our conversation we'll get to that. Both starting from the 1980s, the blasphemy law, which is something that I work on, or I'm along with the Pakistani human rights activists, but also now increasingly post 2014, with an ascendant Hindu nationalism in India. And then, of course, if you look at Sri Lanka, there are new challenges as well. But if you look at the Indian example, I think that the scale of it, or the speed of it, is perhaps something that many of us, particularly people looking at it from the outside, could not have foreseen. Third, I would say is freedom of association, which there's the civil society space, then both sides of it. There's human rights groups are under greater threat than they have been in recent history. In Pakistan, in India, to a large extent in Bangladesh, under Sheikh Hasina's government. Several seminal examples that one can talk about. One that stands out is India kicking out Amnesty International. Very recently, Pakistan, 2 years ago, has kicked out or made it impossible to work. And we'll talk about how that distinction now is also a new one, where there is outright sending somebody, deporting somebody and making it impossible to work, and how that is the case. So in that, and the larger thing is, of course, which hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about, is when we say shrinking space for civil society, is a definitional problem. What we mean by civil society. What I have meant so far in all my examples is an idea of civil society, which is again, when we said the word democracy and democratic society, sometimes when I say it, I mean a liberal or progressive democracy. So in Pakistan, what has happened, I'll start with an example perhaps, is that as we speak, Pakistan, major urban centers, Lahore, one of the largest cities in the world, second largest city in Pakistan, is under complete siege by a group called TLP, which is Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, which is a group which is exclusively formed and advocates for stricter and harsher blasphemy laws in Pakistan. There's not much room for them to go any harsher in terms of they already guided that penalty, but a wider application of it, and that mixes with a sense of xenophobia, nationalism, and what we're seeing now with more and more is that public space being taken. When we talk about shrinking civil society space, or be it in India, be it in Pakistan, if you push all political, grassroots political and human rights groups, that space is of course will not be a vacuum, be it the RSS, be it the TLP. And that, I think, presents new challenges. And I think there's new lessons that these states have learned, sometimes from each other, which is that and I'll talk about how, as a human rights professional, that that's a complicated thing. Despite their animosities, their ability or willingness to learn from each other, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, be them ways of cracking down on human rights groups, new modes of censorship, primarily, perhaps now the most amplified, acute example of that is censorship in the digital space, or be it finding new ways to crack down on religious minorities. And what has happened, I think, from a human rights perspective, is the entire idea. I work, as I said, as Professor Jalal mentioned, I am senior counsel for Asia for Human Rights Watch, and Human Rights Watch has a tagline motto, which is investigate, expose, and change. And the idea behind that, and a lot of the modern human rights movement was that you meticulously investigate the human rights abuse, you expose, you shine a spotlight on that, and that the condemnation that would come with that would lead the perpetrator, in most cases the state, to change their conduct. And now we've seen that being turned on its head. What happens when you shine spotlight on it and large parts of society stand up and cheer? Which is the problem now, which is the problem with the cow lynching groups in India, which is the problem with the blasphemy law in Pakistan. That your entire model of doing this, and I mean, it's again, by no means restricted to South Asia. So be it sort of Orban in Hungary or Duterte in Philippines or Bolsonaro in Brazil. So that's a larger conversation. There is that movement. But in South Asia, what has happened is these states have realized that you are now no longer now claiming often on these things, that we are not committing these egregious human rights violations. I mean, that's not where we get into a conflict and say we're not actually picking people up. We are not disciplining journalists. What they say is that these are enemies of the people, they are parasites. Stop short of saying that we picked them up. So there is stop short of saying that. And that brings a new challenge in terms of civil society space, which is, and similarly for the media, there is the censorship, the old censorship of a midnight knock in Pakistan and India, of a journalist going missing, of a page being left blank, of an editor receiving a call. But there are new ways now. One, of course, larger one is to impeach the business of journalism completely. To impeach, and that presents a challenge to freedom of expression, which is a new one, which is where you say that this entire business of journalism, which is again, we're having this conversation here, something that President Trump took to an art form. But that presents a challenge as well, where what you're doing is that you are providing an enabling environment, you're inciting hate against the business of free expression itself. And that we've seen from Prime Minister Imran Khan repeatedly, from his party, we've seen from Prime Minister Modi and his party repeatedly, which is you're not asking for journalists to be attacked. And you're just inciting, you're not ordering them to be attacked. What you're saying is you take the podium as Prime Minister and you think that, I think many journalists in this country are anti-national. And then you leave the business of the rest to someone else. And that's a new challenge. And that's, we're familiar with this in Pakistani context, where blasphemy for the longest time was what the state learned, was that you don't have to attack everybody yourself. What you can do is provide an enabling environment for any number of actors to do this. So you can stand up and say that, X has committed blasphemy, and you can say it enough times without direct culpability. And now that, I think, model has been exported to across the region. And we've seen that. In Bangladesh, in Bhasanchar, with the Rohingya, we see similar conversation where, again, this conversation of being parasites, or being subhuman. We're seeing this in Assam with the National Register for Citizens. We're seeing this in Pakistan at a scale, I think, hitherto unprecedented, particularly on the cyber space. And that challenge, of course, as a human rights professional, that also comes with the larger challenge. I mean, I'll make the media another media book, which is there is a new way of also censorship, which I think is more of a strategy thing, which is there's intimidation and harassment, but there's also you don't get ads. Your channel disappears. I mean, in Pakistan we had almost a study, and this in India you don't. I mean, journalists get fired. I mean, somebody is critical of the government, and they would get fired not because there is a government directive, because the publisher or the media house owner has changed their mind. In Pakistan, we had for the longest time a rather surreal situation where the Pakistan cable operator took a position against a media house, which is very critical of the government and the military, and said we will refuse to carry this channel because we are patriotic. And that I think is a new challenge. I mean, it's so of course thinly veiled. Often it's comical. It's not plausible deniability in any semi-serious way. But what it does do is that it is one step removed. And what then the government does, which now a lot of these states, and particularly the BJP government and Prime Minister Imran Khan's government, is if a journalist is attacked, you will have senior member of the government saying, we did not do it, we did not. But had we done it, I mean, or not even had we done it, but looking at X, Y, whatever the victim, and the work that they have done, we can understand somebody, which is outright criminal and callous. But that presents a challenge, which I think to the civil society space is a new one. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case of sort of newness of the challenge, because the challenge is the same. The challenge is, an authoritarian state structures empowered with draconian laws and with the capacity and willingness to be nasty. But this mix of old authoritarianism with new populism exacerbates the situation considerably, and particularly when we talk about how to hold these governments accountable. What has happened with civil society space, and now I'll come back to the TLP, the blasphemy example, is what has happened is in Pakistan, for example, is that all public space and all business of public organizing, be it trade unions, be it student unions, be it anyone protesting, is closed. And what that means now is that the TLP, and that's the mix of the crackdown on civil society, on political organization, coupled with the descendant sort of religious rhetoric, is that if you are being in the TLP is also very empowering. So you could be the person who wants to lynch somebody on blasphemy, but you would also realize that the only way that you make somebody listen to you is if you say death to the blasphemy. And so there is of course, I mean, I don't want to put it in that box where it's saying that there is some sudden sort of there is a problem of religious fundamentalism and literalism. That's of course true, but it's not only that. And similarly with I would imagine with RSS, it's now very incredibly empowering to be part of a group which the state either patronizes or if not is afraid of. And what that means is that there is that opposition or civil society space, but that space now belongs to. So because arguably, I mean, TLP is now political because it contested elections. But till 2 years ago, who's to say that they were not civil society? And that's a complicated thing. I mean, it's a complicated thing, and we've heard this about all sorts of religious groups. So that's why I said when we talk about a definitional thing of what civil society is. So there is the challenge that the human rights movement in the country faces, and with that, I think what in larger thing with the human rights movement or the liberal progressive human rights-based civil society is that the entire the idea which the human rights movement is predicated on, that the human rights are universal, are indivisible, are inalienable. And the conversation happened in if somebody did a violation or not. But that's not. And now what these governments have realized is they reject it out of hand. That they don't believe it to be universal, and they say the world will get along with the program. One example is Afghanistan. I mean, without going into the sort of geopolitics of it, in the past few weeks, at least 9 delegations have met the Taliban, including the United Kingdom delegation, including the UNDP, including the UNICEF, who have taken all male delegations to the Taliban and have said, and talked about women's rights and said, we want to look for common ground on women's rights, etc. And part of this is, if it was the Taliban would not meet the UK government if there was a woman. And that idea does not stand up to scrutiny, because in Doha they would. And it's not, it's not if they won't meet the UN. It is that now what a lot of these state structures realize is that there is a greater tolerance for this. There is a greater tolerance for relativizing human rights standards. And there's great condescension in that. Of course, we've heard that. In the Pakistani context, there's great condescension in saying that the Pakistani people are not don't want democracy, for example, or would not, there is, and this was an idea which parts of the Pakistani state, but also parts of the international community did for a very long period of time, that there is some kind of an island of exceptionalism where these people would not want a democracy. But now we see that there's a greater tolerance for that around the world. And part of that is just, as I said, for the human rights movement of the civil society, part of that, I think, speaks to a reckoning that the human rights movement is with being perceived, and in certain cases being centered on looking for, appealing to the West for moral authority, which is just it was firstly a strategy that was meant to be. There's condescension in that strategy, there's ignorance in that strategy, and it's also now set to fail. And there is that. So what we see increasingly now across South Asia is states rejecting the idea of human rights at a principle level, saying the freedom of expression, what's so great about freedom of expression, which takes us back at least 6 decades in time, where first you have to make, which is different from 10 years ago, we're saying that we are not censoring. And, we trying to prove, no, that in fact you are, and footnoting this. Now that has changed quite significantly, where they would say that we're not censoring, but it's a feeble denial. What they're saying is, what is so good about freedom of expression? What is so good about freedom of religion or freedom of association? And that, how it got there, I think there's one thing to be said, but I don't want to simplify that. But part of it was that there is a failure. Failure is a strong word, a disillusionment of the liberal challenges, be the political or intellectual from these states, where we see a failure of an organizational or political failure of liberal political parties. And which is not, I'm not saying that this happened in a completely neutral environment. The hands were raised. But what you have now is, at least in public imagination, you had an elite capture of, and which was, again, which is, as I said, facts might not bear this out, but what you had was an elite capture by people, parties, groups who espoused liberal progressive values. And there's been in their head, that's a larger thing that could be, it could be, as I said, Trump, that could be Brexit. There's multiple examples, Duterte in Philippines. So the shrinking space for civil society now, I think, gotten to a point where if there isn't political mobilization, because that's what, as I said, what we've seen is gradual erosion of all political challenges to, to the state itself and what to the authoritarian state, which I would say all organization challenges. In Pakistan, I can say about trade unions, about student unions, about any kind of collectivization which could happen outside for the moment of the banner of religion, which is what we're seeing with TLP. If it was, we've seen the Pakistan state sort of being very willing, able to inflict violence or to use force robustly against any number of groups. But here, things are sort of coming to a head. And what space, I think what does not bode well for that, this space now in the future, is that there is, and I'll give you the example of, let's say, Taliban, the Pakistani Taliban. When they came into such, when they formed in 2009, there was something I think distinguished themselves from most other insurgent groups, the LTT in Sri Lanka, the IRA in Ireland, which was what they were saying was we are holding you, the state, to your promise of making an Islamic country. And this is what we'll see with RSS now. What we'll see is that the RSS is saying to the BJP is that now we're holding you to your promise of Hindutva, of Hindu nation. So part of this would now become this game of being sort of puritanical. In it means that the radicalized, the literalist, the puritanical wing of that establishment would take it hostage, and that seems to be the challenge. I think in large parts of South Asia. I wouldn't want to sort of generalize about Bangladesh in this vein, because I think that's what's happening there is more complicated, but what you'll have again a rise in nationalism of a different sort. But what now in terms of sort of, all doom and gloom that you know already, but in terms of how to get this space and what sort of, if there is any hope, I do think that there is. And I think part of the lesson or the part of the reason for the hope is digital space. And what we're seeing now is, and it goes both ways. It goes both ways. These states have adapted to digital media. It's quite scary how quickly they've adapted to it. And how, they struggled with and still struggle with the idea of not being gatekeepers of information, where you can't use a kill switch, you can't make a channel go offline, you can't do that with Twitter or Facebook or YouTube. And part of why you can't do it is that you need those tools yourself as the authoritarian state. So your tools of propaganda, so it's going to happen in the same medium. So what their strategy for that, I speculate. No, what part of the strategy for that is not now to shut down Twitter or Facebook, or depending on what part of the region we're talking about, but to flood that information space with their information, which is, you're seeing what's happening with that, and then we've done work in India about how a lot of that's led to, in certain cases, violence. In Pakistan, this is the hate speech, incitement to violence happens. But having said all of that, the fact that they can't use a kill switch means, and the fact that they're so bothered by it, there is great hope. There's now in Pakistan what's happening with the news cycle, and it has happened in India as well, is that the story is not covered by the media, so you can only watch the television or read the mainstream newspaper and not know about it up to the point, and it becomes kind of a joke, because it's you can't go to social media and not see it, up to the point that the mainstream media realizes that it's a bit of a joke. So there is, I think, the idea of people wanting to get their word out. I think then with social media, this won't change. I mean, what that is leading to, their problems with the medium. I don't want to be a social media expert, but there are problems with the medium that makes outrage, that makes a lack of nuance, that makes sort of generalizations easy. So but those are not regional specific problems. Those are, I think, issues with the medium itself. But what it also means is that the entire model of the authoritarian state being centralized, it being the centralized repository of exercising control, has changed. So what we see now, I mean, there's all sorts of, the subversion is happening in all sorts. I mean, without going into examples, in Pakistan there is the discussion on military transition, which not even transition, post-its. I think it's, transition would be sort of overstating it, but and it's utterly bizarre because it's the entire country knows it, and it's like sort of the emperor having no clothes analogy on steroids, because it's comical, right? But what that does, that's subversive in itself. Where so a newspaper reporter is not writing this because his paper wouldn't carry it, but he's tweeting it. Which again, there are problems of sort of quality control, etc., etc. But what that means is it's fundamentally untenable. It is fundamentally, this architecture of censorship is fundamentally untenable, be it in Pakistan, be it in India, be it in Bangladesh. But what that would require, of course, is again, what that would mean is that there will be resistance to authority. What kind of resistance to authority there would be is a complicated thing. As I said, there's TLP is not, it's complicated, but there could be resistance to authority that comes in the garb of being even more right, even more puritanical. So, let's say there is hope, but it is very cautious optimism, because what social media tells us is that people will resist. People will resist an authoritarian monolith imposition, because these are very, very diverse countries. These are countries which are it's very difficult to put them in a box. I mean, all countries are unique and diverse in some ways, but these are more messy than most others, partly because of scale. So they won't be put in a box, but how they decide to respond, I think, would be it remains to be seen. In terms of, but I'll say a couple of things about going back to the media and lack of independent judiciary now, because one thing that remained in many of these countries, in Pakistan and India, and the Pakistan judiciary has had less than glorious history, often during military takeovers and otherwise. But there's always been some resistance, some dissenting voices. So there is a culture of people going to court. It's not, and if you look at other parts of the world, the parts of Africa, the parts of South America, it's not giving up on the court. But increasingly that's becoming complicated. It is not, so I'm not saying that the state control over the judiciary, there is state control over the judiciary, influence, not control. But it's also that the populist streak makes judiciary, I'll give you the Pakistan example or it's not always driven by a direct phone call by somebody in authority. It could be. I'm not saying that it never is. But it is also driven by what you see as your constituency. And I think that's not worked out for the civil society groups in either Pakistan or India, to some extent in Bangladesh, where the safety wall that you had of some kind of, again, I don't want to overstate the reliance on the judiciary, but what you did have was often, like the media, when the media was under great assault, there was a cohort of very robust resistance to it. And similarly for the judiciary. And that is now becoming complicated. That's becoming complicated because part of the project of these authoritarian states is also fragment and divide. And so the fact, I'll give the media example, even during the worst martial laws, on the basic one-point agenda of freedom of expression, you would see, I mean, you look at those videos, there is some solidarity between right and left. So on that similar, and now what they've done is that it is, and I think that has happened, I mean, part of it could be a reflection of society itself, but part of it is actually dialectical, it's feeding the divergence, is that it's so fragmented that any assault on free expression will be met with sort of multiple responses because there's no lack of unity. In Pakistan, that's similar for the court as well. But I mean, I guess given that it's an intimate conversation with a few people, I think I'll stop and if you want me to talk about particular things. Well,
that's fine. That's fine. Thank you so much. It's extraordinary. I mean, the breadth of what you covered. But I wanted to take your title, Shrinking of Civil Space, during the basic freedoms that we see in civil society in South Asia. I mean, is it so much a question of the shrinkage of space or the increasing differential allocation of space? Because, civil society, certainly in Pakistan, has been rather uncivil for several decades. While I appreciate your effort to try and define a civil society, I don't think we got the definition.
I said what I said was, if we define civil society in any coherent sense, where it will hold up to scrutiny, then you would have to. It just has to be broad enough that it is any sort of collectivization outside of the government, which would mean, as I said, then if TLP had not contested the elections, TLP is civil society. Jamaatul Dawa would be civil society.
They are civil society.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
That is why civil society can have uncivil elements.
Yes, that's what I'm.
Not to worry about.
Yeah. No, I'm wrong. What I'm saying is that
absolutely, you're absolutely right. So the question is that this is not just a shrinkage of space; it's a increasingly differential allocation. And I want to come to your point that you made towards the end about the fragmentation, which has been engineered through the neoliberal prism to really sort of get people to mobilize on sectional interests. I mean, this is something that we have been witnessing quite clearly over the decades, which makes it that much more difficult to mobilize in an intersectional fashion to be more effective. But so that's one, set of questions. Related to that, I have another question to you, and that's to do with social media, which cuts both ways. I think we both agree, we all agree. But recently we've seen a Facebook whistleblower in this country telling us that Facebook actually has algorithms which are intended to divide us. So, when we talk about social media and what role it is playing and the curbs on social media that are being implemented, which are again differential, what should we do about social media? Because, there is an element of social media that is extraordinarily irresponsible. So how do we move from that lack of responsibility to an articulation of, freedom of speech? So I'm a little puzzled for what you as a lawyer will say about this apparent contradiction between social media as a means for free expression and also as a means for the obverse. So, should it be regulated? And so how?
I guess on that, the legal answer to that. This is because the legal answer to, in terms of what I speak for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. I think in the past few years, what has happened, and which is unprecedented, it's a major shift, is that the power to regulate free expression, regulate being quotes, for the first time, I think, in modern history, now rests with private actors. With private actors. So Facebook has, the censor was always supposed to be a state actor. Facebook now has more censorship power, or more enabling of the expression power, regardless of how one looks at it, than probably any other country in the world. And what that means is that is complicated because private actors were to be held to a different standard, right? And now there's a discussion. I mean, it's a complicated thing, but they will have to be of course, the short answer to the question if they need to be regulated is yes, absolutely. They will have to be regulated. What the terms of those regulations are is something that we sort of can litigate. But now you have to treat them on free expression at par with the power that they hold. And even with the whistleblower conversation, because they have the power to chill speech, they have the power to try restraint, they have the power to remove speech. So in many ways, this was a power, or this still is a power, that regarding free expression the states have never had it, or now, I mean, they have it at least at par with the state. So how does one go about it in the specifics? Of course, there is the conversation on their own, holding them to their own standards first, which is the standards that they have come up with, which is the standards Facebook comes up with, YouTube comes up with. Twitter, I think, is guidelines as well, which is which are big and broad sometimes and are subjective, but which is incitement to violence, hate speech, etc., etc. But the second is supposed to now move for an international framework, and that's, I mean, I don't want this to be legalese, but to move towards an international framework where these entities will now have to be treated in consonance with the power that they exercise, which is unprecedented. So they will need to be regulated, but it's complicated, as you say, because if that power now rests with governments, so how Turkey would regulate Facebook would be completely different from how Norway would regulate it, or Switzerland would regulate it. I mean, the point of it is, so there is the international aspect of it, and in Pakistan, I mean, there's a case that I was involved with was when Pakistan banned YouTube. I mean, I was involved with because the amicus for the court, and the question simply was there was one video which blasphemous under Pakistani law, and there was the illegality under Pakistani law was, of course, established. And as much as one would say that don't watch it, but that those were constrained by Pakistani law. And the problem was that Pakistan got YouTube at that point. It was because it was not localized. So Pakistan did not have a YouTube Pakistan. So Google wasn't incorporated in Pakistan. So Pakistan will get YouTube as like the YouTube that you'll get here in Tufts, as opposed to YouTube in Saudi Arabia or India, where you'll get a localized version of it. So they said we can either shut it down completely or let it go. And the idea again, but there, I'll give you that example outside the technology context. What happened when the YouTube was banned was you had, I would say it started with a couple of right-wing journalists who started saying that, we've watched this video or become aware of it, and it's outraged, etc., etc. And there was some chatter, but essentially no great ruckus at that point. But once it was banned, to unban it would have meant to take a position which was saying that we don't care if there is a blasphemous video, you don't watch it. So there is I think that, but that parking that aside, I think with social media, there is the power to regulate social media. while the answer to the question if they need to be regulated is yes, the answer to the question of who needs to regulate them, the answer, it can't be domestic government. It can't be domestic government. And that takes us into new territory. Not entirely in terms of you can come up with structures, and there is now some discussion under UN frameworks, etc., which won't be neutral because none of this international law business is neutral, but where it's not on the whim of a government. So that it is complicated, but Human Rights Watch now treats, we would go and do advocacy with Facebook or with Twitter in the same way that we talk to a government, which is we.
Thank you. Yes.
Sure. Thank you very much for your talk, and I think there's a lot to go off of. I'm interested in the neoliberal point, and we can pick up on that. But I'm interested also in the point about political parties, and I'd like you to unpack this a little bit more. And I approach it from the sort of framework. I did my master's thesis on the TLP's involvement with social media and the proliferation of their sort of hate speech, et cetera, on YouTube, which I think is undeniable. But I'm wondering how we square the sort of shrinking space for dissent with the sort of increased, the decentering of the authoritarian populism from the state to political parties. So the TLP is not sort of it is a recent phenomenon in the sense that it's very new, but a lot of the ideas have been percolating for many, many decades. And so I'm wondering how we square this, how you square this in the human rights space, in the legal space, and how do you sort of challenge, in your work with human rights, you talked about challenging the state and their sort of encroachment on human rights, but I'm wondering how you engage with threats to human rights that don't come from the state itself or come from somewhere that muddles the state civil society mind as the TLP does.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great question, and something I hinted at, that these states have become very adept at this, which is that the challenge from to provide an enabling environment for human rights violations, in this case, the freedom of religion, or that is complicated, but often there is, so there is the legal sense of it, so, power of protecting people. If you let TLP lay a siege to, and then the second is, of course, have your equal treatment. So there's if you allow TLP to lay a siege to Lahore, would you do it? Allow the Pakistan Muslim League or the Pakistan People's Party or any number of other political parties to do it. So there is that. But in terms of how to hold, sort of ascertain or sort of allocate responsibility or culpability, I think then we'll have to talk about sort of foundational things, the framework that allows for it. But the state does have agency in that. The state the TLP is not, regardless of our views of how organic or not in terms of direct interference it is certainly not organic, because it is not that the state has allowed for a neutral playground of contestation of ideas. In terms of political parties, I think one point that I'll make about, if we look at what has happened, in my view, of religion in Pakistani politics, and that's you saw sort of failure of religious political parties, Jamaat Islami, even JUI, and part of it is, of course, we could say there hasn't ever been mass appeal of these people in electoral appeal, but there's another thing I think in recent years, which is that all politics went right of center or outright right religious. So how does Jamaat-e-Islami distinguishes itself on blasphemy from any other party? There's Deobandi Barelvi, that's not maybe not in blasphemy, but so all parties have now such a dose of religion that who notices Jamaat-e-Islam? As opposed to TLP, you go completely right field. That even on the TLP, no Pakistani political party, sadly, disagrees with the TLP's stance on blasphemy. Well, I mean, if we get to the facts of it, nobody would say that,
But I mean, disagreeing would qualify you for blasphemy.
will get you killed.
Huh? And how can you disagree
No, you
that
can't.
qualifies you for blasphemy?
Will get you killed.
I mean, it's a circular.
That's the thing, right? It get you killed. So that's the problem with, I think, with the political parties. I mean, we can have different opinions on it, but part of the engagement, and there is that discussion in the engagement with Taliban, etc., as well, and that's happened in the past as well. So you either bringing the religious far ultra right into the mainstream. What can that could mean is, of course, it could bring them in the mainstream, whatever that means, and give them a stake, or what I think in our recent experience means, or it could radicalize the mainstream. And I think that's what has happened. It is that engagement where you said, we will absorb, then it make them a stakeholder. So that, I think, the political parties now on a lot of things, they have moved right, religious, and everybody, I think, without distinction, to all three major political parties on a lot of key questions. So that's that. And in that sense, the TLP, of course, has, I mean, as you would know, these ideas are very old, but these ideas, I mean, one can sort of pre-partition, etc., the examples, but the TLP did see that, in the sectarian sense, there'll be, it's their issue, right? It's also a tough one. Blasphemy is not a Deoband Wahhabi issue, it's a Barelvi issue. And the idea that, they had a majority, it was right for that, and unfortunately for us.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-up question to Professor Jalal's last question on the digital space. And you mentioned something about how they can't shut down or there's no kill switch. But I feel like I'm not sure if for example, you saw there was a blackout in Kashmir where there was internet outage for nearly a month, or you saw parts of Lebanon that went through something similar. You currently have an outage in parts of Africa. So I would say, I'm unsure about where accessibility comes in within that sort of portion of your cautious or optimism, because
Sure. I mean, when I say the idea of a kill switch is fundamentally untenable, I agree. The examples of India's had more internet shutdowns than any other place in the world. Pakistan has them with great frequency. But when we talk about it being untenable, what I meant is that as a viable mode of censorship. And my reason for that is, you can look at example. Look at example of, you give the example of India or parts of Lebanon, or we've seen that in different war contexts. Is why can't you shut internet down beyond a certain point? Because you need the same tools. The state needs the same tools. If you shut down the internet, you shut it down for soldiers as well. You shut it down for officials as well. So, technology might evolve. And, for the moment, the crisis is that you need the same tools. The state needs, and less dramatically, you need to be on Twitter. The Prime Minister needs to send out tweets. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs needs to send tweets. And so, you can get in an Iran situation. But then, the foreign minister is sort of very active on Twitter when Twitter was banned. But that's an exception. What you would need is the same tools. That makes it, in my view, I don't think that would make it fundamentally unviable in the long run, because you will have to. It's very difficult. I think North Korea does it. North Korea, you get access to internet.
What about China's
I was
policy?
about to say, China.
China
I was
has
about
the
to
most
get it.
brilliant policy. It never shuts down, but you never hear the things that you have.
So the Great Firewall. The Great Firewall, I guess, is the aspiration, ambition, dream. The only thing that's sort of stopping sort of many countries in South Asia from descending into that kind of totalitarianism is partially, I think, incompetence and lack of resources, because you need to set this up. So small mercy for them being clumsy.
Let's follow up this conversation with a slightly different, bringing a comparative dimension. I think I appreciate that the problems we are discussing are really quite global in this country as well. But one of the things that's surprising about India, and I wonder whether Namrata wants to join in here on this, is, the pushback factor. In Pakistan, it's a military authoritarian country where the pushback is very limited. But in a country like India, despite everything else, compared to the US, the pushback factor is not there. So I wonder whether when we bring in the US, whether there is something to be said about civil society and its robustness. Because the pushback here, that's what you're getting here. You are getting it, you're not getting it in India, which is shocking. Namrata, you want to sort of add?
Actually, I want to bring in the farmers' protest,
Yes,
which has
of
been
course.
going on for a very long time. I think what is happening there is that the government is very efficiently managing the media channels. And like people are even today sitting and protesting. And I think at this point, this whole thing about what gets shown to you and who gets silenced is actually the
real issue,
key thing that is
differential
happening.
issue.
Yes. So I would say that the pushback is real and we are seeing it, but it is not on on a platform.
If I may, since the conversation has now started, I was giving a talk at Patiala Punjabi University, Patiala, on Zoom. And they were telling me about the farmers movement. And they were saying that this has permanently changed Punjab's relationship with the sector.
Yes.
And that nobody wants to accept that, but that's the reality of how effective it has. So I'm going to get somebody from.
And
Yeah.
like
I'm
how
going to
this
cover
is
the
really
string.
affected is that the one new party that
String.
has come up in India, Aam Aadmi
That's
Party,
right.
they are the ones who are actually, now that the elections are coming, they're actually focusing more on Punjab than in UP because they know that UP is where
No, Punjab is very important,
Yes.
so I'm looking for a speaker for next
All right.
next
Okay.
meeting on the farmers
we can.
movement.
Yes.
And no, the other thing he said is women's role is extraordinary.
It's extraordinary that they're sitting there. It is like how they are also at the hems of the thing, of the protest.
So do we have anything similar to the farmers movement? The Okada stuff has kind of come and gone.
No, I don't think.
What about the PTM? PTM has been killed, has it?
The PTM as I don't know.
I just wanted to, just your point about pushback, and you said that the pushback here is greater compared to India and then compared to Pakistan. At the time that Mashal Khan was killed, and there were also.
Maybe you want to explain, I don't think some of them may not know so much. Mashal Khan was tragically killed.
He was a student at a university in the northwest of Pakistan, and he was lynched, killed to death for alleged blasphemy, as Saroop Ijaz was talking about the blasphemy, just to give that kind of call is enough. But it's never just that it organically happens. There's something orchestrated behind every single blasphemy case that we have seen. There have been orchestrated campaign through their, various organs of that the right wing or whatever, the conservative whatever do. But so people were upset that there wasn't enough protest about Mashal Khan. But the fact that people came out in cities all over Pakistan, even if there were small groups of 150, 200 people, even in Mardan, even in conservative villages, women came out. That was something new. In those areas, women had never come out before. And they came out. And even if they were very small, and what I always tell our friends in Pakistan is that, when we come out to protest in Pakistan, we know we are doing it at the risk of being attacked and killed. We know that and the other side buses in, huge numbers of people in a very organized way. That's one. So, and then at the same time, there were protests happening in India. I think it was the time of Gauri Lankesh's murder, if I'm not mistaken. But there were protests all over the country. If not that, then maybe it was for Rohit Vamula. Maybe it was Rohit Vamula's, the suicide. Yeah. So there were protests all over India. And then at the same time in America, you had that so-called Muslim ban around the same time, where you had thousands of people going to the airports and lawyers staying up all night writing briefs to people coming in. So my point is that the proportion of the pushback, the visible pushback, and then PTM was also, I think, part of that. I think proportionately, it's just a question that I have that you might be more equipped to answer. But I'm wondering whether the democratic political process and how deeply rooted it is and how strong the institutions are, the governors, the judges, the police, and all that. And in Pakistan at that time, we barely even have 10 years of a political process where one elected government passes on power to the next elected government. And in India, you had that process for 70 years minus the 3 years of Indira Gandhi's emergency. And in the US, you had that process for 200 years, something. I'm just wondering whether that proportion of that pushback is relative to the continuance of a continuous democratic political process. And another point, that's one question. And another point that I have is to your point about what's visible and what's not visible, who gets silenced, who gets seen, is that Maria Ressa, the Filipino journalist who just got the Nobel Prize, gave a wonderful talk at Harvard last year, which I was privileged to attend, and I wrote about that also. And she talked about fake grass, astroturf, the social media that you were talking about, Saroop, that how there's an illusion that of that reality, of this so-called reality, of this astroturf, this fake grass, through social media. One social media account pushing false news or attacking somebody. And her organization, Rappler, did a research on it, and she gave a great PowerPoint presentation showing the details of how many people are connected, and how it spreads. And so, to your point about not seeing the pushback, I think in Pakistan also there's in India, I know there's a huge amount of pushback from my friends in India and how they're organizing and continuously carrying on. And I know it's happening in Pakistan. Like PTM is completely censored. If you weren't on social media, you wouldn't know it exists because it's only there. We only hear about it on Facebook, Twitter.
I think your points are very well taken. But could I just add one more aspect to it? What I feel, even though I accept that there's a lot of similarity in all of this. You've talked about the shrinkage of space, which I've thought of differential space. My problem with Pakistan lies in the shrinkage of the mind, the narrowing of the mind, which has happened rather more rapidly because of the educational disasters than anywhere else. So, I wonder, if you would consider that is Pakistani civil society less well equipped than what I don't deny the censorship. But I am concerned because it's not just freedom of speech. What are you speaking about?
Could I come in here?
Yes,
for a
please
minute,
do.
Professor Jalal? I was also thinking of the traditional idea of civil society being a space where hegemony is reproduced. And so how much so I was just thinking that, is there a definitional shift, or our expectations from civil society and state have changed? And if how is that playing out in this new idea of redefining the nation and redefining anti-nationalism? So, I think it really ties up really well with Professor Jalal's point, where are we blaming our systems, the state, but how do we understand that?
Yeah, I agree. I think what Professor Jalal said, the shrinkage of the mind, there is that, that's undeniable. That in the question of how equipped Pakistani civil society is, of course, I can't speak on behalf of Pakistani civil society, but I think not awfully well equipped anymore. And part of it is, part of it is a deterioration. Part of it, and it's not sort of faded away into the sunset, gone giggling into the sea. It has been dismantled. It has been subjected to relentless assault, which is, of course, both physical intimidation and harassment. And now, as Professor Jalal is saying, that the crisis, of course, and then now, as you're saying, the boundaries of civil society activism, of the horizons, considerably, I think, narrowed. And then part of it is it's an educational thing. Part of it is, of course, what becomes acceptable to say, and you get used to. In Pakistan, the first thing about Pakistan that strikes you is, and is that the entire country speaks in euphemism, including ourselves.
A lot of self-censorship.
So, I last week I was in the Balkans in Bosnia and the Republic of Sparska, and and the same thing. And everybody does that. I mean, we used to do some post-conflict. Everybody does. Nod. You would know. I said, no, I don't actually. Actually, I learned to. But what that realizes is that sort of euphemism which of course that's a semantic question, but that distorts. And then there is the nationality thing, or the nationalism thing, is that you have to be a Pakistani civil society member, and what that means in Pakistan is to start from the throat clearing, feet shuffling apology of sort of I as a good Pakistani human rights activist, and that narrows the mind and the space considerably. There is that now, and the pressure. I mean, on the blasphemy example, you'll have to, and I don't exempt myself from doing this. Is that you start off with a bit of an identity politics and say, I as a Muslim feel that, and those things, they might have some strategic value, where in particular contexts, where you're saying you looking to build credibility, but then you internalize them. And what that means is there is now, there is a separate, I think, degeneration, or Professor Jalal was saying, of the education crisis. I think one thing that I haven't talked about, which is a major theme of public conversation in the country at the moment, is something of a curriculum thing, that a standard national curriculum, which might just be a disaster like no other, but be that as it, if we park that aside, there is and I really like the shrinkage of the mind. It's because there is the identity is also growing smaller. It's not only the mind, it's your identity. So what that does is it makes solidarity with regional, global movements, ideas, thoughts more difficult. Because when you can't summon insularity, yeah, and then you can't summon those ideas. And which is, again, just to say that this is not with the Pakistan civil society. This is not something organic. This is the Pakistan civil society. I think is very robust, given what they've had to withstand. But it turns out there is a cost of withstanding that kind of relentless attack.
They also have been affected with years of brainwashing propaganda.
Yeah.
Are there any last minute questions or last questions? Anyone? Nothing from my mind. Nothing from my mind. Well, thank you. This is an ongoing discussion. So, there's a lot more to talk about. I just want to make one last comment to you, maybe listen. I mean, it's a very curious country, Pakistan, because we've been following this tragic, horrific case of Zahir Jafar, and in no country in the world is an indicted individual allowed to speak to the press. What the hell is going on that other people can't speak? This is a question I wanted to ask you. That they have sort of their mouths closed, but upon a murderer, a horrific murderer, is allowed to speak to the press. What's going on?
I guess.
What's going on with your judicial system?
Well, far be it from me to
It is outrageous. I have never seen anything like it.
No, I think it's outrageous. As far as the specific part of what's going on in terms of that particular case,
but it's again the media. I mean, there seems to be a lack of thinking through here. Why is this being allowed?
The idea is that it's part of just having to be either being completely censored or completely being unregulated. So there are no rules of.
This is a murderer being allowed to present his case to the general public. I mean, since where I've never heard of anywhere in the world.
This is the first time. I think this happened before.
It's in Pakistan.
Did it happen with Qadri?
No.
His video was shown. There was a video in which
It happened with Saroop Mirza. I don't know if you remember that.
Oh, yes.
Saroop Mirza did it from his death cell. He said, I'll do a tell-all. So yes, I mean but that speaks to the impunity, right?
That
That's a
is
culture
why
of
it's
unity.
actually a deliberate question for you to think about civil society, because I mean, this is the civil society. It is an uncivil society.
That's true. I mean,
And that's where Pakistan has come down to. And I think India is fast catching up and taking over,
Very, very
actually. So, I mean, it's a very sad story.
I think that what's remarkable about Pakistan, what really gives me hope, is when I see that despite this onslaught on the education system and the deliberate trying to shrink the minds and all, you have people coming up in all kinds of places that are, like you were saying, resisting in so
Not for
many
long,
ways.
not for long. I mean, once you bring in the great single curriculum, you had it. I mean, all that has been happening is that the deficit in the public educational systems has been partially provided by the private institutions. But unfortunately, with this zero common denominator, lowering of standards to be equal, is the most inane idea I've ever come across in my
And they
entire
started
life.
implementing it.
It's really, I wanted us to really go there
yeah.
about the prospects of Pakistan. They look very grim compared to the other South Asian.
But I think the same is happening in India as well,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
across the board,
If
universities
there's any
and schools,
consolation,
yes.
right, yeah.
These conversations
no
are happening.
consolation.
I'm not sure if it's a
Yeah.
consolation, it is a very grim situation.
No, it is. But I think I completely agree that the single national curriculum, of course, on what it represents, I mean, what it is, what it does, and what it represents. Part of it is, of course, part of it is we've seen this entire thing, taking out Malala from the curriculum. This has all happened in recent past and being substituted by all kinds of exercises. But part of it also, so it will make, of course, ill-equipped, more insular, and part of it could be a language thing. I mean, Pakistan is certainly in no position to teach physics or chemistry in Urdu. I mean, the books have not been written yet. So they will now have to, somebody will have to write, and but part of it is what it represents, and what it represents is more insularity and monolith national identity with that the
On a positive note.
I thought I had sort of your thoughts while doing this.
Right.
I think I have one more very, very grim question. So India uses the minority politics and says, we are bracing this Hindutva nation against the Muslim populations. But I'm trying to understand, how is Pakistan justifying this?
We're fighting this Hindu nation.
This will soon not exist.
Well, I think the blasphemy politics is very minoritarian.
Well, I mean, the larger question
I think it's actually it's internal. I mean, the whole blasphemy ethos is to claim authority over the divided community of Muslims by saying that, why have the Barelvis got off? They've got off because the TLP has got off because it became more strident. So anybody who can provide a more strident comment in this manufacturing, quote unquote, of consent on blasphemy succeeds. So that is where social media is playing a role as well in allowing this kind of stuff. And that is why my question to you about the regulation, which you very rightly pointed out is not going to be easy, is crucial. But it seems to me that this is part of a global discourse. And I wonder where this is going and whether the human rights people shouldn't have their voices well articulated in this digital question. I guess increasingly more legalistic. But there are human rights issues involved here as well. And I wonder whether these will be picked up.
I imagine that would be the primary challenge for the human rights movement globally of how they deal with this. I think that the reckoning has to be done. And there's many examples of how the work of human rights has changed, partly because of technology. The speed, not only the speed at which human rights work is done, but the scale of it. I mean, human rights work now, for example, it could only be done. So the argument was, for example, something like Auschwitz can't happen today, which who knows? Because what would happen is somebody living at the train station would no, but that's a human rights argument, I think. I know but I'll give you an example of what we did for human rights work. in 2017, when the Burmese army in the Rakhine state, Myanmar, there were reports coming of the Rohingya Muslims being subjected to what we did not know, what we now know as ethnic cleansing, to violence and displacement. Nobody can get into the Rakhine state. But what you could do now is, there was a monsoon, you could look at, it's also, look at satellite imagery, map the Burmese army's route, and see entire set of villages being set fire to. And why I say it's the monsoon, which means that those fires have to be very deliberately lit. Fires don't break out in the monsoon. And this was inconceivable 5 years ago. This was so that the space of, there's a Central African Republic example that one can give. So there is the interface with technology has changed things, some things, and then the fact that evidence of saying that, this is no report, this is satellite imagery, often public sourced, which shows the route. And there's one example of I think slightly, it became comical, but the location of several, I think it's a couple of years ago, US military bases in Africa was given away because of the Fitbit thing, because you have this Apple Watch for a Fitbit. You upload your data to a app, and there was a data leak, and what it turned out first, I think in somewhere in North Africa, with the nearest town was 20 kilometers. There were 35 Fitbit users who were running so not only giving away that there was a base, but also giving the sort of dimensions of the base, because they would run around the base.
That's both ways.
This cuts both ways.
Anyway, I think this conversation can carry on. I look forward to talking to you further today.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Great to be here.